Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and loads of love to each and every one of you. And do let me know where you're from. If you haven't told me where you're from, please let me know because it's so fascinating. And also let me know what your special, incredible drink is because so many of you get back to me. And the stories I learn from you, the drinks you drink, the incredible parts of the world you're from, it's all incredibly exciting. And it's really fun to think that we could all be gathered together in this moment in time, listening to a story as if we were around a crackling fire. So let me know where you're from. And if you're from Florida, this story is going to definitely be up your street because here we come to this part of your world. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification and the thumbs up because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I really love the way people share their Bigfoot encounters with you, by opening their hearts. I hope to do justice in sharing with you mine, for I am a staunch believer in serendipity. I'm not inclined to trust in random chance, as I believe the sequence of life flows smoothly, like a river on a purposely preordained course. That is why we should never be disheartened or dismayed by what life throws at us. It is all part of a spectacular divine plan. A resplendent tapestry, of which we are one of those rich golden threads. I believe the experiences that greet us along this journey of ours were unequivocally premeditated and mapped out for us before we were ever born, although our reaction to these events is exclusively of our own making. In simple terminology, let's just say that rather like a thunderous current beating against a rolling stone with an almighty force, is exactly like the loving hands of the Creator, shaping us with his toothed chisel, moulding us, chiselling us, sharpening us into becoming instruments of great worth, transforming us into the best versions of ourselves that we can possibly be. Granted, sometimes the lessons in life are very hard, cruel even, but then no sculptor worth his weight in gold ever created a masterpiece out of a rock that he did not chip away at or gouge at the surface with some very hard blows. In my humble opinion, and I'm so sorry to say this, but this is how I intrinsically feel, some obscure nonsensical story of a blob of dense black hair passing your truck that you are convinced was a Bigfoot is not a fully satisfying story at all, for it lacks depth, substance, gratification, especially to the person listening to such an unsatisfactory account. I'd liken it to tasting a tiny nibble of a sumptuous, spectacular strawberry cheesecake, but never fully experiencing the full feeling of enjoying the entire slice. In such a case, you would walk away feeling dissatisfied, deprived, hungry, and unfulfilled. I'm sure you would agree that a simple taste of the cheesecake does not give you a full impression or measure of it, for indeed you need substantially more to fully appreciate its lofty creaminess, rich layers of flavour, sweetness from the strawberries, sourness from the cream cheese, and of course the crisp-textured base. You can only ever achieve that place of satisfaction, gratification, or nirvana, if you like, when you indulge in the entire slice. Only then can you rub your stomach in gleeful contentment or consummation, knowing that you enjoyed that cheesecake to the fullest. The pleasurable, rewarding memory will stay with you, for anything that is rarely good always invariably does. The trivia, the mundane, the unimpressive will be deleted from your mind like the wispy smoke from a chimney on a cold winter's night. So this is what a story should be. Otherwise, it's no story at all. How could it be? For if its memory fades soon after you hear it, it touches not your heart or fails to provoke in you thoughtful meditation or insight. Ostensibly, then its purpose was pointless, meaningless, and of no abiding value. In my case, it was a series of serendipitous events that led me to encounter the hairy man, or as we say here in Florida, the skunk ape, as he's widely known in these parts. I assure you, without enlightening you about the bizarre sequence of events that ultimately led to my encounter with the skunk ape, you would be exorbitantly robbed of the full experience. I would not want to do that to you, nor to your listeners. That would be like offering you a crumb, and you deserve better than that, much better. You deserve a full slice of the action, as if you were there yourself with me at that very point in time. In fact, I would love nothing better than to lead you by the hand into the heart of my story. I would like you to join me in the Florida swamps to meet the skunk ape yourself. While I can't take you there literally, I hope to do so figuratively, so please come with me. I was born and raised in Florida by two very loving parents. My mother Hilda was exceedingly intense. She took life way too seriously, failed to see the humour in anything, while my father was as laid back and chilled as a lazy crocodile sunning himself on a blissfully warm rock. I loved my father because his easygoing manner brought a measure of calm in my life, like a cool, refreshing breeze that I always appreciated, which helped me immensely when studying for exams or being involved in stressful situations of any kind. He would say, "Big deal. So what if you fail? What's the worst that can possibly happen?" While my mother would react very adversely, as if the whole house had suddenly been caught up in a tornado, swept away by a gale-force wind. If I were to fail at anything, that is. I think I was afraid I would break my mother, like a fragile figurine that takes flight off the mantel, leaving behind hundreds of broken shards. I don't think she could have emotionally taken it if my grades had been poor. Thankfully, they weren't. We lived in a sprawling bungalow, on a spacious plot of land, along with many of the other similar nondescript houses in our neighbourhood, all looking much the same as ours, lacking the quintessential charm and character seen in more historic old-world homes. I would never describe those homes as pretty, but they were basic, practical, and suited our needs. We lived in an area surrounded by unforgiving, swampy marshland, some that could not be accessed by foot. Black Cayman crocodile country, shall we say, full of snakes, alligators, poisonous spiders such as black widows, brown recluse, fire ants, unfriendly insects that revelled in nipping every area of your exposed skin if you gave them half a chance. Of course, there is beauty in this marshland, seen in the voluptuous shapes of the cypress, willows, tupelo, and black gum trees, with their sculptural trunks rising in pretty twists, curls, and spirals through the water, their lower submerged trunks usually swollen up by the water it imbibes. Then there are the viridescent, resplendent, vibrant greens of the brush, along with the cattail reeds, horsetails, papyrus, marsh marigolds. But sadly, the beauty can so often be overshadowed by the perfidious treachery of such a place. For lurking down low in the dark shadows of the murky water, you might just suddenly see an eye open. From what you initially perceived was just a piece of driftwood. That, you realise, was not a piece of wood after all. Suddenly you discern the lateral wave-like motions of a jagged tail meandering unsuspectedly towards you. Your safety becomes seriously compromised as it nears its menacing approach. So growing up, my family avoided the swampy marshland that fringed the borders of our home, pretty much like the plague. It was a hostile, unfriendly environment, wrought with many hidden dangers that we wisely chose not to embrace. I do remember it was in the cruel summer of 1982, when I was about 15 at the time. The weather had been unbearably hot, uncompromising, very unpleasant. It had been a day like any other, but our next-door neighbour came bolting through our house like a rock being flung through a window, not even extending the common gracious courtesy of even taking the trouble to knock. I'll never forget the pained, wretched look on her face as she dashed into our house. I was in the living room at the time playing Scrabble with my younger sister Sabrina, as staying out of the unrelenting vicious heat by remaining indoors was one way to keep cool. The rounded, well-upholstered 400-pound woman was seemingly bursting out of her tight-fitting flowery dress that made her look like a sausage stuffed, as it was several sizes too small for her, and was taking strain under her desperate movements, as if the seams of her dress were about to pop open. But those things were of little consequence to us at the time. It was her demeanour that grabbed our attention, as she was oscillating her arms around wildly, like a frantic octopus. Her incomprehensible words, burbling, trembling, like the jiggling crystal glasses perched on the sideboard of our bar area. She looked like a wounded woman, someone who had the weight of the world on her shoulders, as if she was crumbling beneath a heavy load, and quite literally collapsing under the strain of her emotional, frenzied turmoil. She was not crying, but her eyes were wide, alarmed, terrified. "Are you all right, Mrs. Jameson?" I asked clumsily, dropping my whole line of Scrabble pieces on the floor, for I could sense her terror. It charged the atmosphere of the entire room with electricity that literally raised your antennae, making you mindfully aware that something was desperately wrong. Very wrong indeed. But what it was, we couldn't even begin to imagine. "Howard!" she asked, looking at me in desperation. "Where's your father?" she stammered. "Where's your father? I need his help right now. I need his help right now. What's wrong, Ruth? Said my father, entering the room, sensing the woman's rising level of trepidation, and all too eager to help the poor woman in any way that he possibly could, as he knew that her husband was spending time with relatives in Texas, and she was all on her own. Please help, she cried, her strained voice sounding tiny, squeaky like that of a mouse, as if she was struggling to get the words out. Little Bobby told me that Liesl went to the swamp to play with the crocodiles. At that my father's expression sank, like the bright golden sun fading after a long sunny day, only to be replaced by dark, looming thunderclouds. He grimaced. What? What did you say, Ruth? Please, say that again. Little Bobby told me that Liesl went to the swamp to play with the crocodiles. I don't think he was kidding either. I can find no sight or sound of her. Please hurry. If she's out there in the swamp, I don't know what I will do. The crocodiles will eat her. Calm down, Ruth. I'm sure your daughter hasn't gone far. We'll do our level best to find her. Now, don't you worry. My father grabbed his rifle, told the women to call the sheriff at once, unhesitantly ventured into the dismal, primeval, swampy area that fringed our properties on the furthest side to search for the little girl, his heart heavy, fearful of what he would or would not find. For indeed in the heart of crocodile country it would be easy for an innocent little 8-year-old girl to go amiss, never to be seen or heard from again. For a predatory crocodile is remarkable at hiding the evidence of his duplicitous endeavours, while an 8-year-old girl would be a welcome, hearty snack. As my father ventured into the swampy area, he could see no sight or sound of the little girl. In his frenzied panic, he called out her name. Liesl! 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 And swore blind that the disembodied echo of her name was relayed back to him, as if somebody else was calling out her name. Liesl! 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 But who? As for beyond the wild animals in this inauspicious place, there was no human to be found. It would seem that no one else had been alerted to the fact that Liesl was missing. Well, not yet, anyway. So who on earth was calling out her name? My father described this experience as the most ghost-like, airy, or haunting moment of his entire life that sent shivers down his spine, his blood running icy cold. For indeed he was struggling to maintain his composture, as a foreboding, inauspicious feeling overcame him. In a trice he could hear the sound of treading feet moving in shallow water, which was about 6 foot deep. He glanced up to see that marching through the thick, muddy sludge with an air of nonchalant indifference, with a dead crocodile flung over his left shoulder, along with 2 dead snakes tied up together in a knot, dangling over the other, like a couple of coiled scarves, was what he could only describe as a skunk ape, for indeed it could not have been anything else. The creature spontaneously opened his mouth to repeat my father's calls. Liesl! 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 It cried with a glint of amusement in his deep-set eyes, as if he was taunting my father, or if that was indeed not the case, he was including my father in an amused private joke, as if the name Liesl had broken the ice between them, sealed an unlikely friendship. My father couldn't decide which. This daunting, imposing creature was enormous, with powerful ape-like influences to his appearance, along with aspects to him that were profoundly human, most notably seen in his dark black leathery human-like face, with a flat aquatic nose and sloped forehead. My father described him as being covered in long dark flowing hair, towering at about 10 foot tall, built exactly like an army tank. His hair was saturated by muddy patches that clung to his coat like cracked clay. Worse still, the creature smelt rarely foul, like damp dog combined with decaying flesh. My father watched in awe as the creature gave him an amused glance, then simply trotted away, whistling to himself and intermittently calling out Liesl's name. Liesl! Liesl! A new sound to his vocal repertoire that he clearly appreciated. Of course, we were to find out that Liesl was nowhere near the swamp. We might have guessed as much, for it seemed that the naughty, mischievous brother of hers loved pulling stunts on his poor, gullible, easily deceived mother, who was so quick to believe the worst. The cheeky, duplicitous behaviour was not a new thing, nor was it ill-meaning, but something he delighted in. Ostensibly that infuriating kid loved winding up his mother, and with his reprimanding dad safely out of the way, he was having a field day winding her up, for when the cat's away, the mouse most certainly play. It tickled him pink to see his mother become so frantic, and realising that the obscure words crocodile and swamp held in themselves incredible power in pushing her right over the edge. He loved the way her furrowed brow would contort with horror, and appeared to find everything terribly funny, which might explain why in his later years he became a prominent comedian. By the time my father returned from the swamp empty-handed by this stage, there was a kaleidoscope of police cars gathering around the neighbourhood residents, while Liesl came trotting out of the opposite house, along with the alarmed neighbours, who were mortified to see a vast police presence gathering around their house, and were wondering what the fuss was all about. "What's going on?" they asked, their faces furrowing with puzzled expressions. "We've been looking for Liesl Jameson," said the sheriff. "I see she's been with you all the time. She's safe and well, I understand." "I was only showing her our new puppies," exclaimed the woman. "Pippa, my spaniel, gave birth to 7 puppies last night." "Never you mind, ma'am," came the sheriff's reassuring voice. "People get their wires crossed all the time. At least Liesl is safe. That's all that matters. Believe me, madam, this is how we like all our stories to end, on such a happy note." Mrs. Jameson ran towards Liesl. I noticed half of her dress had actually popped open. She grabbed her startled daughter so tightly. "I thought I'd lost you, Liesl. I thought I'd lost you to the crocodiles in the swamp." As to which the child answered, "I don't like crocodiles, Mummy. I like puppies, though." The sheriff raised his cowboy hat in a gesture of politeness, his face barely able to contain its broad beam. His soulful brown eyes twinkled. "That little boy of yours, Mrs. Jameson, a spirited one he is, a real prankster you've got there, shall we say, winding up not only you, but all the police to boot." "I'm so sorry, Sheriff," said Mrs. Jameson, flushing bright red. "I don't know, Sheriff. That boy of mine, oh, he'll be the death of me. He's always putting harmless snakes in my bed, winding me up like a bedside clock. I should have known the moment his dad was out the way, that out would come his guileful, mischievous pranks. But this last stunt," she said, growling, "I could kill him. He made me think his own sister had gone to play with the crocodiles in the swamp. And I believed him." "You shouldn't overreact, Mrs. Jameson," laughed the sheriff. "It's your horrified reactions he loves. The scared facial expressions, the petrified screams. Those are the things that are like candy to your son. I was not unlike that myself when I was his age. I loved to scare the living daylights out of my poor mother. It was hardly a wonder that by 32 her hair went completely white on my account. I blush to think of the things I put that poor woman through. I even brought a crocodile into the house once. She screamed like a banshee. I loved every minute of it. I can't say I blame her. Even so, I'm sorry for wasting your time, Sheriff. I really am." "Don't be ridiculous, Mrs. Jameson. I'm just exceedingly happy that your daughter was playing with puppies, not crocodiles. As far as I'm concerned, having her safe back home is a job well done." To all intensive purposes, the sweet, adorable, butter-wouldn't-melt-in-your-mouth Liesl was blindly oblivious to all the mayhem she'd caused in her brief absence. "Never ever do that again," said Mrs. Jameson, pointing a warning finger at her daughter. "As your mother, I need to know exactly where you are 24/7. Do you understand? You can't just go slipping off like that without telling me where you're going. That cannot happen again." But I did. I told Bobby. I told him I was going to play with the puppies over the road. I told him to tell you." "And he told me you were playing with crocodiles. Now you are the one that needs to tell me. Do you understand?" Fast forward to later that evening. My father never ate a single thing, but sat in front of the television watching a sports game, with a glazed look on his face rather like a dead fish, that suggested that he hadn't absorbed a thing that he was watching. If you had asked him who was winning the game, he would have been completely clueless, given you a vague, dissociated look, as if he was 1,000 miles away. I watched my father chugging copious cans of beer down his throat, buckling them up in his fists, squeezing the aluminium metal tightly, then aiming them directly towards the wastepaper basket, sometimes narrowly missing, so some of the cans ricocheted, rolling back onto the pristine cream carpet, while stray droplets of beer splattered across it, speckling it in light yellow stains. "What on earth is wrong with you, Ethan Lockwood?" my mother had said, shaking her head in annoyance. "You're one hell of a lazy man. It wouldn't take much effort for you to get off your backside, would it, and walk over to the wastepaper basket? Instead, you're mooching around like a lazy sloth. Too lazy to even get up to put the can into the wastepaper basket yourself. Furthermore, if you're not going to watch the sports game, then I would very much appreciate it if we could watch something decent together for a change. A romantic movie, perhaps, would be nice." At that, my father groaned in agony, like a belligerent dog that was being informed about an up-and-coming nail-clipping that was soon to be scheduled. My father grumbled some loose words that rolled off his tongue that were barely audible. "What's that you're saying? Speak up, Ethan. I can't hear a word when you mumble like that." "I saw a skunk ape today." My mother chuckled. "You saw a skunk ape, did you? I'm sure you see many things, Ethan Lockwood, when you've had as much to drink as you've just had right now. Why, I do believe you've drunk a dozen beers, possibly more, eaten absolutely nothing. No wonder you're seeing things. Your imagination is shooting duds, dear." I was sitting at the couch at the time, enjoying the sports game, even though I was so young. But I had noticed something about my father that ruffled my feathers distinctly. He was behaving very strangely. The way he twisted the cans of beer, throwing them at the wastepaper basket. The way his attention wavered like an undulating choppy sea. The way he'd barely touched his stew and beans that night, that lay on the tray untouched. All unlikely behaviour that was decidedly uncharacteristic, unorthodox and atypical for him. I knew my father was telling the truth. I could feel the excitement welling up inside me, for over the years I'd heard mention of this elusive hairy man, or skunk ape, so to speak. But my father, having a chance encounter with one, it didn't get better than that. "You saw a skunk ape, Dad? Where did you see him?" "Your father didn't see anything, Howard. Look at him. He's inebriated. You can invent anything when you're drunk, just for attention." My father almost growled. "I'm not making the story up, you silly woman. When do I make stuff up like this? If I told you I saw a skunk ape, I saw a skunk ape. Why should you doubt my integrity? He was calling Liesel's name, if you must know, when I was out there looking for her. He heard me call her name. He mimicked my calls." "Really, is that so?" said my mother, raising a sceptical brow. "I told you, Howard, your father is well and truly bladdered. Look at him. I hardly think a skunk ape can talk, let alone call out Liesel's name. Have you ever heard anything so ridiculous in your entire life? Your father is a complete embarrassment to himself when he drinks far too much. You mustn't listen to him, son, when he gets like this. You see what drink does to your head? It screws your mind, blurs the distinction between fact and fiction." I watched my father's square jaw stiffen, his muscles tighten, his dark brown eyes become indignant. His mouth trembled for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but he wilfully bit his lip to restrain himself, for he knew he might regret it. He wisely understood that my mother would never believe his anomalous account, so what was the point anyway in arguing about it? After all, he'd only be ramming his head against the brick wall. A squeaky voice grasped my father's attention. The voice was mine. His brown eyes darted towards me. "What is it, Howard? What did you just say, then?" "I believe you, Dad. I believe you saw a skunk ape. I don't care what Mum says. I know you're not drunk. I know you saw it. I believe you." My father's face visibly softened. The contours of his face relaxed. His brown eyes began to twinkle. "You believe me, son? Well, at least somebody does." I nodded. "I do." "Were you scared, Dad, when you saw the creature?" My words seemed to throw my father off course, rather like a boat at sea losing its momentum for a moment. It was as if he had not considered that very thought. "You know, son, I should have been terrified. But I was so shocked. Caught off guard, if you like. I never considered my fear for a moment. I guess I was benumbed by my own intrigue. It must have been that. Imagine if a huge African lion for a moment just walked past us in the living room like a domestic pussycat. You'd be afraid. Of course you would be. In normal circumstances, you should be. But a lion in the house right now would be such an astonishing sight that it seems so incongruously surreal that you say to yourself, did I really see that? Surely not. You are so caught up in a befuddlement that tangles, knots your confusion, rather like a messed up piece of knitting you're trying to unravel. While your mind is processing everything, your fear is quite literally hijacked, held to ransom or suspended by your shock. It's like that, I imagine. Why don't you go back to the swamp, Dad, where you saw the skunk ape? Then take a picture of it, a photograph. Then, when you show it to Mum, she'll have to admit that you weren't making it up. Then she'll know you weren't drunk. It'll be evidence, clear to see. Son, that isn't a bad idea. I'm liking your suggestion more and more. My father's inner mind was positively gleaming at the idea of wiping the smug expression off my mother's face. When he showed her the indisputable evidence that the skunk ape was not a creature drawn up in his wild imagination from an overindulgence of beer, but this thing was indeed very real. Can I come with you? I piped. Please, Dad. I really want to see the skunk ape as well. I really do. Please don't say no. I'm not sure it's a good idea. Those marshes are very treacherous. Well, I'll be careful, Dad. We'll be careful. Please. Please don't say no. Very well, son. But not a word about our secret to your mother. For if she knew in a second that I was dragging you into the heart of crocodile country, she would have my guts for garters. And I mean that literally. Forget owning a new pair of crocodile boots, son. You'll be wearing my hide instead. I won't say anything, I assured him. So there we were, accessing the very same marshy area that my father had frequented before. It was swampy, unwelcome terrain, but our efforts, if fruitful, would be worth our while. It was a scorcher of a day. We had barely left the house, and the searing heat was making me sweat profusely. It felt like we were in a walk-in sauna. The buzzing insects were making conditions far from agreeable, but my determination to seek out the skunk ape negated any negative considerations for the both of us. We weren't certain if we would actually see the creature again. We weren't confident about it at all. After all, sighting the skunk ape once was indeed a remarkable achievement, but twice, that would be one for the history books. My father seemed to remember the route he'd taken through the swamp, and even the shape of the cypress tree he was standing next to on the day in question when the skunk ape had so randomly, fortuitously crossed his path. It was a very distinctive tree, with several shapely branches twisting and curling around themselves. It was here, he whispered to me. It was exactly here where I saw it. I could see the excitement bubble over in his face like the fizz from a bottle of champagne. He was almost trembling, as arriving at the scene of the encounter had brought it all back flooding. All of a sudden we noticed 2 dead snakes tied together in a knot, hanging over a tree. That's his work, said my father excitedly. The way I saw him, the last time I saw him, he had 2 snakes like that slung over his shoulders. I bet he's coming back for them. He must be around here somewhere. Get your camera, son, ready. Don't forget to take a shot at the moment you see him. What can we do to get his attention? I asked my father. To draw him into us. We need some kind of bait, surely. My father's face lit up like a Christmas tree, as if he suddenly had the best idea ever. He began to call Liesel's name. Liesel! 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 For a long time there was silence beyond the trills, tweets, warbles and unidentifiable sounds of the swamp. Then we heard on the wind the sound of the name Liesel, echoing back to us. It was the most bizarre experience I've ever had. My father was absolutely right. The sound was haunting, for it seemed to almost wail. Liesel! 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 I looked at my father, startled, the blood draining away from my face. Did you hear that, Dad? I said, trembling with excitement, my heart literally leaping into my throat. Did you hear it? It's him, he whispered. That's what happened to me last time. I think he's coming. Oh, my God! I think he must be coming. It was in that second my mind was flooded with doubt. as if for a fleeting moment it occurred to me that me and my father could be playing with fire, or rather a reckless game of Russian roulette. What if the skunk ape became aggressive towards us? What if it was dangerous? I think my father was having the same doubtful thoughts, as waves of regret seemed to rise up in his eyes. "Son, I shouldn't have brought you here. What the heck was I thinking? And all just to prove to your sceptical mother that I saw a bloody skunk ape. Does it really matter a toss if she believes me or not? I think it doesn't." In that second we smelt a strong wet dog smell, with skunk-like undertones, that was so unpleasant it made me gag. The smell was then succeeded by a low guttural voice, calling out Liesel's name. "Liesel! Liesel!" Then we heard the sound of heavy feet treading water. At first it was a tall, dark, dense silhouette, a blob of black that you could have been forgiven for believing was a hefty tree trunk pacing through the water on its own accord, like a spectral, ghostly apparition, that rather reminded me of the moving trees in the movie of The Lord of the Rings. It looked exactly like that. By all accounts, this creature's hair was a perfect match to the bark on the trees, for indeed if he was not moving, your eyes would have failed to perceive him at all, for you would almost certainly have not known he was actually there. I stood frozen like a statue, as standing a few feet away from us was the skunk ape himself. Nothing prepared me for what I was witnessing. I didn't know what to think, as all my thoughts seemed to spiral away like the smoke from a chimney. I didn't know what to feel either, for even my vexed, confounded emotions were like a roller coaster of confused adrenaline spurts. Should I be afraid? Should I be ecstatic? Should I be wary? Should I be careful? I was none of those things, but my body was as rigidly tense and as straight as a pencil, as I gawked at the strange, anomalous creature, with gog eyes like a goldfish, for nothing prepared me for the size, smell, or even look of this thing. It was exactly as my father had described, only much bigger than I could have ever comprehended. There wasn't a shadow of a doubt in my mind that this creature was emotionally intelligent. I could witness the discernment in its eyes. The human connection was definitely apparent. I'm in no doubt that the creature was aware of his commonality and congruity between us, as much as we were with him. For a moment the creature stood there very still, observing us with a keen interest through his steely, dark, deep-set eyes. I discerned that he appeared particularly friendly towards my father, as if he had reunited with an old, long-lost friend. He looked at my dad and said, "Liesel! Liesel! Liesel!" My father replied by saying, "Liesel! Liesel! Liesel!" and they did this again and again. The skunk ape looked terribly pleased, thrilled even, and for a while my father and the skunk ape exchanged Liesel's name together as some kind of verbal connection between the two of them, which lasted for at least over 10 minutes, possibly more. In the fullness of time the skunk ape nodded. Then he turned around, when I randomly said, "Haven't you forgotten something?" My words caused the skunk ape's head to swivel around to follow my gaze. I pointed to the 2 dead snakes tied up together hanging on the tree. The skunk ape's face lit up with recognition, as if he suddenly realized he had indeed forgotten about his tasty snack. He glided towards the dead snakes. He was about to throw them onto his shoulder when a hesitancy overcame him. He scratched his head as if making a decision borne about by some internal dialogue. Then he willfully broke off one of the snakes, handing one to my father, in a gesture of friendly generosity. My father was so humbled. He accepted the gift graciously. The skunk ape looked absolutely delighted. His eyes twinkled with pleasure. He nodded at us and then turned around and glided away. Soon his dark silhouette became lost by the swamp. "Did you see that?" piped my father excitedly. "Did you see that? The skunk ape gave me a present." I nodded excitedly. It then hit us both like a brick to the head that we'd forgotten to take any photographs of the creature. "I'm sorry, Dad. I completely forgot to take a photograph. I just think I was so stunned by what I was seeing that it didn't even cross my mind." My father chuckled. What does it matter, son? If your mother does not believe our account, we both know what we saw, son. No one can ever take that away from us." When I returned home, I couldn't help but tell my mother the exciting news. I showed her the dead snake that we'd been given as a gift by the skunk ape. I regret to say that she was far from amused. did not share in our enthusiasm. Instead, she growled at my father. "How could you take Howard into the swamps, Ethan Lockwood? What on earth were you thinking? The place is swarming with crocodiles and poisonous snakes. Anything could have happened to him." "Mum," I said, "didn't you hear what we said? We saw a skunk ape." "I don't care, Howard, if you saw a pink hippopotamus doing gymnastics on a tree, or a purple elephant doing somersaults," piped my mother. "All I care about is that you never ever go into the swamp again," she said, shaking her head of bright red curls belligerently. We were to learn after that experience that some things are indeed best left unsaid. But as I return to the beginning of my story, I don't think it was random that we met the skunk ape. Not at all. It was meant to happen to us, as nothing is as capricious and arbitrary as it may actually seem. For as it is written by the Hopi Indians, when we show respect to other living things, they will show respect to us. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.